My presentation is going to be about work that I'm currently doing with UNESCO in relation to indigenous knowledge in the Pacific Islands. And the reason I am very excited and very grateful to be here to talk about this is, first, I think it may inform you and the broader audience for this colloquium on the current state of climate transformations in small islands in the Pacific Ocean. And second, there may be also some interesting subjects for discussion in conversation with other of our presenters. So I have a kind of hybrid thing here. I have about 30 pages of paper, which I've completely cut up so I don't take all my time, and I have a few slides. I'm hoping I can come across clearly and speak to what we've been discussing so far yesterday and today. So I'm going to begin by reading. In recent years, there has been a growing awareness that climate change is having an early and dramatic impact on small-scale indigenous and marginalized communities due to their location in some of the most vulnerable environments on the planet. The sense of urgency that this awareness creates has led the United Nations to declare highly vulnerable regions, such as the Arctic and the Pacific, to be the front lines of climate change. Such places include circumpolar and high-altitude regions across North America and Eurasia, and especially thinking of the Andes and the Tibetan Plateau, arid landscapes in Africa and Asia, and a multitude of islands. One theme that is common to this emerging international awareness is that climate change is already happening across Oceania and that it requires immediate response. Two thoughts come to mind. First, in line with some of what has been expressed by previous panelists, is the temporality at work. Specifically, one could credibly claim that various Pacific Islands communities are already experiencing the future that we are anticipating. That is our future, the one we anticipate for ourselves, and which is characterized by uncertainty and perhaps hopelessness, and which we imagine and project in our particular ways. For this reason only, it would seem to be crucial to pay attention to the current experience of local people in these environments. But also I want to demonstrate how their vision of the future and the present may not be quite what we think. Second, the urgency of this global awareness means that there is now a significant increase in the flow of resources, foreign experts, and climate policymakers being directed at building capacity and adaptation in the Pacific. In particular, I work in a part of the Pacific, of the Western Pacific, called Vanuatu, which is this group of islands here. It's an independent nation, a republic, and it has been receiving enormous amounts of money and foreign expertise in order to deal with climate transformations, climate change. They've even created, I think they're the first country in the world to have created a ministry for climate change, which is seen as a sort of a triumph by many sectors, including many environmentally minded sectors. I'm not so sure. This has created levels of bureaucracy that are interfering with our ability to understand people's local experiences. And this is partly what I'm going to talk about. Because these efforts are largely predicated on a model of international bureaucratic intervention and rational choice theory, people will modify their behavior if they perceive a simple economic interest in modifying their behavior. I mean, a lot of this continues to repeat the same false premises of development monies, where there's small credit is extended to people for sustainable growth and sustainable activities. And so there's almost a complete disregard for indigenous environmental experience and practices. I'm thinking, for instance, small-scale alternative business models have to do with continuing the notion of economic growth with the trying to marry it with notions of sustainable exploitation of natural resources, such as in Vanuatu, in Fiji, in various other islands across the Pacific, introduced fish species, right? Fish are brought from Africa or Amazonia, and they're farmed in order to make it sustainable so that people don't have to fish in their own reef, but they can then exploit fish from other parts. Of course, when those fish get away from their farms and life begins to take its own course, then we get a little more worried about that. In response to this, there's a team from the United Nations, from UNESCO, called the Climate Frontlines team. And they're the people I've been working with for the past 4 years. And we decided to organize quite an exceptional meeting of Indigenous knowledge experts from across the Pacific. And this took place last year in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And the experience of getting a very large number of different experts and community representatives from across the Pacific to come and talk to us about their climate knowledge and experience, and then try to translate that for climate policy design, that is what that we're involved in right now, and that's what I want to talk to you about. I think I've split this talk into 3 parts. The first is to offer a kind of very, very brief overview of what the state of the climate in the Pacific is today. There are certain things that we know, and there are certain things that we think we know, but we don't really know. And some are counterintuitive. So, to be very brief, the biggest threat that we perceive as outsiders to small island contexts is sea level rise. It's very simple. It follows a very simple mechanical lineal logic. The ice is melting from the poles, the oceans are rising, small islands at sea level are being eradicated, period. However, it's not all that it would seem, because this is a very static notion of our planet and of its ecosystems. And it ignores 2 things. It ignores the deep past with which these people in the Pacific are very much involved, and it also ignores the dynamic nature of the environment. So, for example, just very briefly, most of the islands in this map, which are sorted out according to Indigenous and modern nation-state sort of separations, they have, some of these follow the boundaries and borders of contemporary nation states, but most of it is rendered in Indigenous names for these groups of islands. Most of these islands are small, they're inhabited, but they have very radically different environments. If you take a line drawn from West Papua here, and you go across Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Kanaki, and then up to Fiji and down to Tonga, that is a line where the Pacific and the Australian plates are intersecting. Though all of those islands that I just pointed out, they're being uplifted. They're a result of the uplift between the Australian and the Pacific plates. And the Pacific plate is on top. In general, most of these islands are rising at rates that are actually 2 to 3 times faster than sea level rise over the next 100 years. So anywhere between 20 and 80 centimeters a year. That's a lot. There are a lot of seismic shifts, there are a lot of earthquakes, there is much volcanic activity in all this area, and most importantly, all of these islands concentrate 80% of the population of the Pacific. So, first lesson here, and I'm just simply throwing out a very simple geophysical piece of information here that most of us ignore, because of course it makes headlines to say islands are disappearing and people are running all over the place in a panic. Well, they're not running all over the place in a panic. 80% of Pacific Islanders are not going to be threatened by sea level rise, generally. What I've just said is a very, very broad generalization. Of course, islands are unstable things. They can break up plate tectonics are very complicated, so some islands can even break up into bits, and some rise and some fall. So it's not all very clear here, but it's counterintuitive to the narrative of marginalized poor people living in a state of passive resignation, right? The second is, for most of the other islands, of course, that's the question, right? So Kiribati, Tuvalu, parts of Tahiti Nui are atoll islands, and they are certainly, they're on the very, very front lines of climate change, and those are the places where we get most of our images from, where flooding and sea level rise is beginning to have a very concrete effect. However, even there, our knowledge of atoll systems is still quite limited. And so, for instance, recently there's been very interesting information to suggest that atoll systems grow according, coral grows according to the rise in sea level. Does this mean that we're all okay, that we shouldn't worry? No, of course not. But it does mean that perhaps we're directing our attention and our resources into the wrong categories. For me, it has been much more obvious that the biggest damage to some of these systems, especially the equatorial parts of these islands, are going to do with changing rainfall patterns, disastrous rainfall patterns and changing rainfall patterns. And also ocean acidification. That's a much greater threat. And that is something that is going to affect the entire planet, not just small islands, in a very rapid period of time. As far as rainfall patterns, this now brings me to the second part of this. So that's a very, very broad overview that, things are not quite what they seem to be, even in the most vulnerable places, first. Second, so what about local experiences? I'm going to synthesize here. I mean, there's two ways I can do this. I think I'm going to offer a very, very brief sort of set of examples of what happened when we brought these indigenous experts together. The challenge, so recently there's a lot of calls for incorporating indigenous knowledge into climate policy. We've already seen Elizabeth Pavanelli, her opinion on why this doesn't quite work. And that was part of what prompted us to bring these people together in a space of their own making and in their own terms. And what they produced was really quite incredible, because one tends to think, well, indigenous knowledges are almost incommensurable. People are going to come and present their knowledge in ways that are ritually esoteric and untranslatable, not susceptible to conversation across a table with, say, a meteorologist or a marine biologist. Well, these people were up to it. They made an enormous effort to translate their very complex knowledges for some of the natural scientists that we brought in, but the natural scientists were quiet. They were not allowed to present. So most of the materials here were condensations that these people from different communities across the Pacific brought in. Now, when I'm talking about a group of indigenous experts, I'm talking about more than 20 people. So these are just very, very, I have three very brief examples visually. I just want you to see what the kind of things they brought to the table after we prompted them to. So here's a very quick, how did we, it was right click and full screen, right? So, yeah. So this is the presentation that was brought in by a by a local knowledge expert from Papua New Guinea who lives on a very small place called Cranket Island. And I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Don't even, there's no point in reading this. Notice how he focused on the traditional calendar of Cranket, and he was able to translate some of this. He read through some of the literature. We gave them a little guide to literature. And so he was thinking about salinity of soil and what's going on with their yams, their yam gardens, how the island's being affected, where it's being affected. We then gave him a little bit of help to put together these images that he took himself. We gave them full freedom to take film or pictures. And he composed this. We've been working since 2010 with this group. So he composed this set of pictures showing what's going on with rising sea level and greater tides and the damage to the shore. He took pictures of the flora and fauna, and then he kind of summarized it very quickly. And he gave us also a little video, which I'm not going to show here. But you can see this. This is almost, I mean, this example shows that these people are quite capable of translating their knowledge into terms that we non-experts will understand, right? And to do it in sophisticated ways. Here's a second one. Again, these are just very quick examples. This was from a lady from an Aboriginal Australian community. And again, she pretty much did this all by herself. Notice calendars again, right? And then she gave us a few ideas of what the ocean is. These are coastal people in Aboriginal Australia. I think it's northern Queensland. And influencing factors on the seasons and the ocean. And then she gave us her songline, or part of her songline for her people and her territory. So she situated this knowledge very clearly. And then she related it to some of the sort of climate lexicon for climate experts that were there. And then related it to a number of other things. And there's a condensation of her calendar. This was an Aboriginal Australian lady condensing her experience into this PowerPoint. And of course, there was more than just PowerPoints, but these are very brief examples of what came together. And one of the most extraordinary things that we did was we also had a couple of postgraduate students work with some of these communities to give them guidance. 6 communities in Northwest Australia asked for a person to give them guidance and help them condense their knowledge into this wheel. And again, it's a sort of calendar of seasonal activities and knowledge. And it very clearly emerged that what many of these groups were doing was to offer us their seasonal calendars as condensations of environmental knowledge. That was their way of presenting their environmental knowledge in a form that was apprehensible to non-experts. And it was just fantastic. I mean, this is truly incredible. I'm still trying to work out how best to produce policy briefs for bored bureaucratic policy designers in Paris and in Bangkok and in Manila without losing some of the very important connections to land and affect and people that are in these things. So, you know, I'm trying here to make, if I had to summarize what form these knowledges took that we might learn from, the first is it was generally communal. These are genealogical models. They're not the production of a particular expert. They are very much a production of ongoing engagements by networks of people. They're storied. A lot of this was performed. I'm giving you a very static set of visions, but they were performed for us. Songs were sung, stories were told, prayers were offered. The theme of movement, constant motion is present here. You cannot know if you're not constantly engaging with your surroundings. Certainly knowledge is situated. Several people have mentioned this. This is, for those of us who follow the debates on indigenous knowledge, environmental knowledge, this is a truism, but it cannot be stressed enough. Territory and person are linked in very complex ways across the Pacific, including Australia. And most importantly, it's always open to reconfiguration. These knowledge experts were quite comfortable with condensing their knowledge and presenting it in this form, although this is not the form they would discuss it among themselves, right? They wouldn't necessarily make models out of their knowledge, but they did it for the sake of opening a conversation with us and trying to create something new. And this is where I relate to Pavanelli's notion of possibility, potential, right? Emerging forms of knowledge. It is plural. All of these people understood that they were talking about radically different environments. Vanuatu is not the same as Fiji, is not the same as Tahiti, is not the same as Northern Australia. This all has to be able to come together. Not because we respect each other, but because it's there. And it's just a question of saying, okay, this is yours and this is mine, and how are we going to come to a common agreement on the effects of something that is bigger than all of us, right? In this case, climate change. It is affective, so affective, emotional, as well as effective. It works. Here I want to point out calendars are very interesting because they point us to food production, especially seasonal work, engagements between people and the land on the basis of growing things. And what was quite interesting was the internal diversification of practices and knowledge, so that many of these systems of producing life, food, are extremely diverse. They're already very resilient. They have enormous levels, thresholds of flexibility to climate variations. Why? Because in the case of Aboriginal Australians, they've been living for 60,000 years in a place we consider a desert, but they made it productive for themselves. In the case of many Pacific Islanders, it's anywhere between sometimes more, 6,000 or more years, 3,000 or less, depending on the parts of the Pacific that you're in. And the diversification of practices meant that there's an enormous flexibility to adapt to very radical transformation. So for example, one of the things I've been following in Vanuatu is how the very violent disruptions of El Niño, this oscillation of sea surface temperature and rainfall patterns, is already built into how they diversify their soil and their crops. None of this has been taken into consideration in climate policy design, not currently. It's only very slowly beginning to emerge as something with potential value. And part of what we're doing is trying to stress why this is valuable, not just for them, but also for us. So where is this subversive? Because I have the word subversive in my title. I want to suggest, my experience over the past few years trying to bring this sort of knowledge into the sphere of climate policy design with international organizations has been very frustrating. I'm quite pessimistic about the ability of the current regime of climate governance to incorporate this knowledge in an effective way. What's the alternative? A kind of anarchist sort of climate policy design, which is radically local, and I realize I'm going off the deep end here perhaps for some of you, but honestly, you got to try talking to some of these guys. I was talking to a geophysicist in Vanuatu, trying to explain to him how people understand the volcano to be a living thing, and he said, I don't give a shit what the natives think. I'm here measuring the volcano, and I will then tell them when it's dangerous or it's not. Whereas when I approached some of the local people living on that island, they said, these people come here and tell us to adapt. We've already adapted. Our grandfathers adapted, our grandparents, our ancestors adapted. What do these people know? What do they think, we're stupid? And this is quite tragic. It speaks to a very problematic level of misunderstanding of not communication, right? And I think we can't wait for managers and climate policy designers to come around to this. People aren't waiting. They're already going ahead. There are several ways, I could go on and on, but I want to end with a little anecdote in relation to this kind of anarcho-climate policy vision of mine. Between 1999 and 2003, there was a civil war in the Solomon Islands. I'll just put that on the map again so you know where I'm talking about. Right there. There was a civil war in the Solomon Islands, and essentially the national government collapsed. The civil war was especially concentrated in the capital between warring groups of politicians and their hired thugs. Politics by other means. Probably a very normal sort of situation. But this meant that national government collapsed. What happened was communities immediately took up alternative ways of local governance with their own police. They organized themselves so that they were able to continue to operate education and health facilities without letting them collapse, because there was no more Ministry of Education and no more Ministry of Health. When the Australians and New Zealand came in 2003 with a force of 7,000 soldiers to stabilize the country and recover the government, they realized there was no anarchy. People were just going on their everyday lives outside of the capital. To me, this is a very dramatic example of how communities already know how to govern themselves. I'm not calling here for the collapse of all national governments. What I'm saying is there's an enormous amount of creativity and capacity in local communities to take on challenges that we think are impossible unless it's at the level of some sort of super organism, some super institution or set of institutions. Again, I could go on and on about this, but I think I'll just throw it out there for you to think about.